There was no single moment when it broke. No sharp sentence, no definitive absence that demanded acknowledgement. It arrived quietly, the way certain realizations do. Without urgency, without drama, like noticing that a room has grown cold long after the window was left open. I remember sitting still, aware of the passing of time but not reacting to it. The phone rested nearby, not as an object of temptation, but as a neutral presence. I didn't check it because I already knew what it would offer. Waiting had stopped feeling like an action. It had become a position I occupied, something my body maintained even when my thoughts wandered elsewhere. At first, I called it patience, then understanding, then maturity. Each word sounded responsible enough to protect me from questioning what I was doing. But patience, when stretched without direction, begins to lose its integrity. It thins, it becomes porous, and eventually, it stops serving anyone at all. What unsettled me wasn't the absence of messages. It was the subtle shift in how I moved through my own days. I delayed small decisions. I kept my schedule loose, flexible, adjustable. Not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to create friction with a presence that was no longer fully there. I told myself it was considerate. I didn't yet recognize it as self-removal. Waiting has a way of disguising itself as loyalty. It asks for nothing up front. It feels noble in its restraint. You don't demand. You don't pressure. You simply remain available. And availability, when unexamined, can quietly turn into erasure. Silence played its role well. It never contradicted my hope. It allowed me to insert explanations wherever there were gaps. A complicated phase, a demanding season, timing that required care. I held these justifications gently, almost reverently, afraid that if I pressed on them too hard, they would dissolve and leave me facing something less comfortable. My life began to organize itself around contingency. Plans became provisional. Joy felt premature. I noticed myself thinking in terms of later, as if the present moment were merely a waiting room. Even the things that had once grounded me lost some of their weight. I was present, but not fully anchored. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was that I wasn't waiting for communication anymore. I was waiting for permission, to proceed, to settle, to exist without hesitation. And the longer I waited, the more invisible that permission became. I rehearsed conversations in my head, not confrontations, but clarifications. Simple sentences that asked for nothing more than alignment. I never spoke them aloud. Not because I lacked courage, but because I sensed that words wouldn't change the structure I was already inside of. Explanations don't always liberate. Sometimes they only extend the suspension. I told myself that restraint was dignity, that silence was strength. And in some contexts, it is. But I began to feel the difference between self-control and self-neglect. One preserves integrity, the other slowly abandons it. If this reflection resonates with you, consider subscribing. Some lessons only make sense when you stay. I never asked to be reassured, not because I didn't need it, but because I didn't want to reveal how much ground I had already ceded. There is a certain pride in enduring quietly. From the outside, it looks composed. Inside, it can feel like standing still while everything else continues forward without you. I watched how quickly I learned to minimize my own disappointment, how naturally I reframed absence as neutrality. There was no overt harm, no clear neglect, and that made everything more confusing. Without a visible wound, it felt unjustified to acknowledge the ache. I had no accusation to make, not even internally. Time behaved differently then. Days expanded without distinction. Weeks passed without markers. Waiting flattens experience. It smooths everything into a single, unremarkable surface. You stop expecting momentum. You stop anticipating change. You simply maintain. I began to notice the physical aspect of it before I named the emotional one. A quiet tension in my shoulders. A subtle fatigue that wasn't tied to effort. A sense of being held in place, as if my body were bracing for something that never arrived. The mind can rationalize indefinitely. The body is less patient. I didn't confront them. Not out of fear, and not out of passivity. I simply recognized that whatever explanation might be offered would likely preserve the same imbalance. I wasn't interested in being convinced to remain in a state that required constant adjustment from my side alone. The realization, when it finally settled, was calm, almost neutral. There was no surge of anger, no dramatic clarity, just an awareness that I had begun to disappear from my own life in reasonable, defensible ways. I had made myself easy to postpone, easy to reschedule, easy to forget. Dignity came to mind often during that period, not as an ideal, but as a boundary. Dignity doesn't demand acknowledgement. It doesn't issue ultimatums. It simply stops offering what is not being received. So I withdrew, quietly, without announcement. I stopped holding space where nothing was being placed. I filled my days without checking whether it would create conflict. I made decisions without imagining how they might inconvenience someone else's uncertainty. I let unanswered silence remain unanswered. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a strategy. It was alignment. That shift wasn't comfortable. Waiting had given my days a certain structure, even if it was fragile. Letting go meant standing in an open space without narrative, without anticipation. No expectation softened the edges. There was just presence. I didn't gain clarity about them. That wasn't the outcome. What I gained was awareness of myself, of how easily patience can mask fear, how loyalty, when unreciprocated, quietly turns inward and begins to corrode self-respect. Self-betrayal, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a decisive choice. It accumulates through small postponements, through the repeated decision to wait one more day, one more week, without asking what the waiting is costing you. There was a moment when I realized that stopping the wait felt almost like loss, not because of what I was giving up, but because of what waiting had allowed me to avoid. Waiting carries a promise, even when it's false. It suggests that something might still happen. Letting go removes that illusion and leaves you face to face with the present as it is. That confrontation was quieter than I expected, less painful, more honest. I returned to my routines without the sense that they were placeholders. I noticed how different it felt to engage fully without monitoring my availability, without editing my life to remain accessible. The space I had cleared didn't fill immediately, but it no longer felt empty in the same way. When I think about waiting now, I no longer see it as inherently virtuous. Waiting can be generous, it can be necessary, but it should never require you to become smaller in order to remain acceptable. The moment you begin to reduce yourself to sustain a connection, something essential has already shifted. There was no closing conversation, no final understanding, just a gradual reorientation toward myself, and that was sufficient. Some endings don't need to be named. They don't need to be justified or explained. They simply dissolve when you stop sustaining them. And in that dissolution there is a silence that no longer feels heavy. It feels clean. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan.